Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Crossroads, and I'd like to welcome my guests from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Hello, Arnie. Always good to be with you.
Pleased to have you, Robert. How's the weather where you are?
The weather is all right, but I had a big disappointment, I think, last week. I don't know if I mentioned it on the broadcast or not, but I had a Canada goose
That's
nesting
right.
in my backyard.
Hmm.
And yesterday I looked out. A Canada goose, if you can believe it, sits on the nest for 28 days without food or water.
Hmm.
I thought the mate must be bringing the poor thing something to eat, but I did research on it, and that's what they said. I was going to bring some food, but I decided I won't if I'm going to interfere with the natural course of things.
Yeah,
Anyway,
yeah.
yesterday I looked out, and the nest was demolished, and there were four eggs scattered all over the place. And there was a cat sitting there. I assumed the cat was guilty of the
Hmm.
crime, but one of the eggs was eaten, so I don't think a cat would eat an egg. It might have been a
Hmm.
fox or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Terrible. The goose
That,
was gone,
that's
you
that's
know.
really disappointing. The Canada Goose
Yeah,
saga and losing the nest and the eggs that are laid. And it's such a beautiful bird, and it is. And last week we saw photos of it. And
yeah.
welcome, Wallace Clink.
Hi, Ernie. Well, things are pretty normal here, except we're getting April showers in May,
Hmm.
and it's really not bad. It's a little cool maybe for this time of the year, but it's not bad. It's great. Everything is pretty well normal, being abnormal in Canada.
That's it. Normal but abnormal. That's exactly right. Our weather is, we're heading into autumn. Winter is next month, and we've had some showers, not a lot, but my rainwater tanks are starting to fill. So that's always handy. So I'm pleased with that. The gardens are growing. The chooks are still laying eggs, and the bees are still busy. There is pollen, there is flower in the trees. Most of the bees enjoy the eucalypt, the nectar flow from the eucalypt. That's where most of the honey comes from. So we've got that the bees in the backyard, and that's always delightful. As long as you're relaxed around them, they're relaxed around you. Okay, let's go into our political realm, the newspapers, and let's have a look at what's actually going on. In the Australian, front and centre is all about the budget that was handed down last night in Parliament, and of course it's all smiles, and everything is just absolutely wonderful, except that the budget is borrowing. The federal government is borrowing in excess of these sorts of ridiculous numbers. It's just continuing to spend over and above the tax base. The tax base is collapsing because of COVID and the shutting down of businesses and, of course, people in isolation. It hasn't, the repercussions of this haven't been completely felt yet because the subsidies to JobKeeper, JobSeeker, the subsidies to industry and the individuals is such that it's a false sense of reality. Our federal government has, if you like, brazenly gone into the market to borrow hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars, and it is absolutely absurd, this level of debt. And they're eulogising our treasurer. I think they're preparing him for the prime ministership, and of course, what's going on is the in anticipation of the federal election, which I would expect that it would be called if this budget is accepted strongly by the media. And again, the same shaking hands, smiles, all that sort of stuff, typical sort of propaganda that's coming from the newspapers, main sources of media. Epoch Times is still out there. It's doing what it does, and it's finding some resistance. They've started their own TV show here on the left. Um, these blokes are doing the best that they can with their understanding. In my view, I believe they're blindsided to credit creation, Douglas social credit, but they are people who are out there attempting to resist the communist tyranny coming from, in particular, coming from China, but also across the West, the communist tyranny. Um, this issue of Fauci and his historical ties with Wuhan Virology, the lab, and with COVID-19, really, you've got to consider that these things are not clean slate. These things don't just accidentally happen. There's design, there's plan, there's purpose, and that to me is what's actually showing in the news. Election fraud, things like that. That's what's showing. In instance here, this is in regard to rugby changing its name Was called the Saxons, but of course it denotes an English, or if you like, a white person's history, and so they're changing their name. Political woke, typical propaganda, responding to propaganda, quite frustrating. This pastor here was the one who told the police to get out of his church. He yelled at them, calling them Nazis. Well, they've arrested him, and this is what it looks like. There is some sort of support base coming up around him to respond to that arrest, so they can fight it through the courts. But you've got to bear in mind, the government, at least the government through control by banks, has a never-ending supply of funds, and so it goes on. This one is an interesting, it's a blueprint from Canada in regard to Beyond 150. I got it sent from a Canadian contact, and essentially what it's about, you can download the report, and that's what I have done. What it's about is about to the point of debt where it becomes so great that the central banks claim they basically foreclose on an entire nation. What we've seen going on with Europe, with Greece, with Portugal, Ireland, things like that, they foreclose on an entire nation and they claim the assets of that nation as their own. And that's what this particular document is foretelling. It's showing you that all the assets, including your home, your property, your vehicles, every single thing will belong to the central banks. You will have no control whatsoever over the natural resources of your own nation. The central banks, who create money out of nothing, will be claiming ownership of all these things. And that's what that particular article is about. Very, very important to recognise that. And even Michael Journal, they do a good job to the best of their ability. I'm really impressed with who they are and what they do. And of course, this article here, The Power of the Creators of Money, 1694, Bank of England. These things are very important parts of our history. In Australia, we have a history of the Commonwealth Bank being established late 1911 and opened its doors in 1912. It was opened as an independent, self-reliant servant of the people for 12 years. And Australia processed the First World War across that period debt-free.
Mhm.
It processed the entire war debt-free. That's what a bank can do, a people's bank can do. Whereas what we're seeing since 1924 is we're seeing the progressive emasculation of all the banks and handing this power across to central international banks, handing this power of credit creation. And this is now the full circle. Where does it end? It ends in these same central banks claiming the assets of the entire nation as their own, as it forecloses on the nation. This is very, very important that we consider the ramifications of handing this power over to central banks when it should be a function of the central government or the federal government. All banking credit issue should be a function. But it's also, of course, we've got to consider if we allow central government this power to issue credit, is it too much power? And what is the correct response to this threat of power handed over to central government? It really, really is important that we look at this question very, very carefully, because it has the seeds of liberty and it has the seeds of totalitarianism mixed in amongst it. The wheat and the tares, or whatever it's called, the chaff, are mixed in together, and we've got to identify what the real question, the real problem is, and what the correct answer is that serves the individual. Your thoughts, Robert Klinck?
Yes, just a comment on Pastor Pawlowski, who was arrested in Alberta, dragged away, manacled behind his back. I tell you, Arnie, if you watch the video of that, you will see at least 6 large police vehicles full of policemen who stopped a man on a highway, an absolutely peaceful man who is no threat to anybody, whose whole life is dedicated to feeding homeless and helpless people on the street without discrimination of age, race, or anything else. And they drag him down. They put him on his knees on the ground, and they haul him away. It took a virtual army of policemen to execute this raid. And I think they come out in such numbers because if they're a gang, if they're a pack, then the individual conscience doesn't come into effect. They can transfer their culpability in this operation to the group. And therefore, that's why they're encouraged to go out in gangs rather than to, one policeman could have walked up to Pastor Pawlowski and asked him if he would come along, please. And I'm sure the pastor would have. He won't do it when he's giving a church service, but he's prepared to cooperate otherwise. But instead, they come up with this big military operation. It's a scandal. Anyway, Canada seems to be almost in the forefront of the revolutionary activities that are going on under cover of COVID. I don't know if you caught the comment that Trudeau made, but he said, building back better and the Great Reset were a continuation of the activities they were involved in before COVID appeared on the scene. So I don't really think Canadians were aware that he was involved in these plans, but he admitted candidly that he had been. So what we're seeing is not a spontaneous response to a novel problem. It is what Rahm Emanuel, the former chief of staff of Barack Obama, called the good use of a crisis. Never let a crisis go to waste, he said. And so we have crises coming at us one after another, and I don't think that they're all just inherent in the nature of things. These crises are being developed in order to provide governments, specifically now this globalist government, with the excuse to interfere in our lives and take away our freedoms. So that's most unfortunate. Now, we have in Canada, as far as I'm concerned, clowns running the government. Nothing could be more ridiculous than this Trudeau, who gets up there every day and tells us what we should be doing in order to contend with COVID. All the politicians are. What do they know about it? They know nothing. They have no medical expertise. And yet they're coming up with all these instructions that the population's supposed to follow. Well, we also have a governor of our Bank of Canada, and I think he got to be laughed out of office. This man actually said, this is a couple of years ago now, that Canada, the Canadian economy, is running at 99% of capacity. Well, who would believe that? Any business, any manufacturer could probably double his capacity if he had a market for what he was selling or constructing. So it's just nonsense. We half the arable land in Canada is lying idle because we don't have a justification for exploiting it agriculturally. And yet this man, the governor of the Bank of Canada, can come up with this preposterous statement. It's as though we're straining at the reins, we're maximizing our capacity to do anything. 99% of our capacity is being used up, he says. Well, this is nonsense. And it's time for us to stop accepting the criteria and the definitions of these professional financiers and economists, because it's all, I could think of some nasty words for it, but it's nonsense. And they're all contrived in order to put our minds into a false perception of reality. The reality is that we're living in a time of incredible abundance, and we should be recognizing that. You know, the Christian position is that we live in a world of abundance because our Father made wonderful provision for us, and He gave us the capacity to enhance that provision by means of technology, you know. So that is one perspective. And then there's the other perspective, which is sustainable development. And sustainable development just looks at controls, shutting down productivity, denying the abundance of the earth. It is an absolutely perverse, in fact, I would say a diabolical perspective that has been insinuated into the minds of the population, particularly into the minds of the young. We have to follow this agenda of sustainable development. Well, it's just going to thrust people down to a subsistence level of existence. It's a completely perverse attitude toward the resources and the richness of the earth.
That's beautifully put, Robert. Beautifully put. That the world is a place of plenty, and that propaganda, especially sustainable development and this COVID thing, are deliberately hamstringing the productive capacity, which of course is only in idle mode. In Australia, we have no major industries there. They have all been shut down. At one stage, north of Adelaide, we had not only coal mining, uranium mining, uranium, gold and copper, but we also had steelworks. I think it's just limping along, but only just. And we had a shipbuilding yard there as well. And because of the port facilities, we've got lead smelters further south. We had at least two car manufacturers, which kept one to the north, one more so slightly to the south. At least two car manufacturers, white goods, all these things were going on in South Australia, and now none. So you cannot tell me that the economy is doing anything at all. And of course, if these industries are shut down, then that means that the wages going out to people are also not occurring. And so you've got this massive issue of underemployment, of people that are only just going from hand to mouth, subsistence level. That's right. Your thoughts and comments, please, Wallace Klinck. Okay, looks like Wallace has dropped out, so I'll just bring us back. Sorry to see that. We're struggling at times technically with what we're doing. Okay, so the thing is, within Australia, we look at things politically and we consider our governments are indebting us. Our governments are actually pushing us to the point where we can't actually secure our own income. We can't secure it simply because they are hamstringing our ability to actually generate work, to generate industry, to generate something that actually could be viable, our own security. I mean, you think about car manufacturers. Car manufacturers can also turn into troop carriers and things like that quite easily. So the conversion between industry and military about protecting your own borders to me, is absolutely vital. And I think we need to really think about in the end, what's the purpose, what's the intent, where we can't even actually stand up and hold our own. We can't feed ourselves. Australian, because of the water restrictions that they're imposing on us, we're having trouble feeding ourselves. All these things become part of the significant problems that are going on in Australia. Now, I've just bear with me. I'm just going to try and get Wally back. And once we've got Wally back, I'll give him the floor. No, that's not him. Let's try this one. You there, Wally? Okay, you've got the floor.
Okay, Arnie. Well, obviously, I'm at a disadvantage again, not being able to hear Bob. He almost looks like he is taking some mystical pleasure in the fact that I can't hear what he's saying. But nevertheless, I'm going to dive in and have my say.
Good on you.
I think, Arnie, I know it's critically important that we take proper cognizance of your statement that credit must not be placed in the hands of the state. As a social creditor, we believe that creative initiative originates with the individual, and creativity stems from individuality, from initiative, creativity. And if you put the credit power in the hands of the state to the disadvantage of the individual, you're going to do irreparable harm that is fascism essentially, or communism. It's statism, and you're going to do irreparable harm to your society. So what you're saying is very important. We must ensure that the credit of society is available to each individual in society from the productive standpoint, and at the consumption end in the ability to obtain and enjoy the fruits of that initiative that has been directed to creative production. So I wanted to just emphasize that point. It's very important. Social credit is concerned with the individual, and we must not allow ourselves to be enticed into the false, dangerous policy of placing credit power in the hands of the state.
Thank you for that, Wally. That's very important. We've just got some audio issues coming up here, and I'm just going to just work our way through it. Just stay with me. Let's have a look. Map the audio. Okay, we've got that across. All right, I'll summarise for the sake of Robert in regard to what you just said, Wally, and that is that
you don't have to, Arnie. I heard Wally say that.
Oh, excellent.
So I don't know what you plugged in there, but it solved the problem of my not being able to hear him. He looks as if he still can't hear me. Maybe I should throw an insult and see if he gets a reaction.
Okay,
I can hear.
Oh,
that's excellent.
Well,
we've been having
just
to give the audience some idea. We've been having technical problems the last few weeks where Wally and Robert can't hear each other. Now, we've narrowed it down. We believe it's something that occurs in North America, not in Australia, because we're able to record all of the audio. This is just a heads up. It's important where we're going, and I'm going to get back to it in a sec. But wrestling these technical issues, even though we're doing it, what we're saying is of such vital importance that we've got to come back to and listen, even if this show has got lumps in it. We've got to come back and listen and come back and review and consider the arguments that are said, because these are absolutely vital. Our governments are indebting us to the tune of really trillions. The tune of trillions. If you're United States, it's honestly some of the numbers that come out of there, 17, 20, 50, 150 trillion worth of debt. What does that mean to the most productive nation in the world? What does it mean to Canada, to Australia, to Britain? We've got to go back to credit creation. When did it actually go wrong? Why did governments hand it over? I mean, you think about 1694 Bank of England. At that stage, England was using tally sticks. Tally sticks, it's a piece of wood perhaps this long, and it had markings on it, and it was split. It was a certain type of wood that would split beautifully in lengthways, and you could match the tally. Government, or if you like the king, issued the tally for someone to go and do their business, and they would claim services back. And that person could use the tally and claim it back against their taxes. So it was a form of, if you like, a closed loop form. Now, in its infancy, that's fine, but to a sophisticated manufacturing economy, it's not. There are anomalies in the manufacturing system, and that is that it doesn't generate sufficient spending power in the community to offset against the prices that go into the products that are actually made. And this anomaly has not been addressed. We've had the Industrial Revolution for several hundred years now. This anomaly hasn't been addressed, and it's got to the point where spending power in the hands of the individual is insufficient to buy even a fraction of what the actual industry can make. And that's why you've had this argument. They've been trying to keep the lid on this financial anomaly for over 325 years. 325 years, 1694. You go back to that. And so it's really, really important we look at it. How can every government in the world, every nation in the world, be indebted to central banks? And now, with what Wally's just said, if we hand this power over to central government, then what we're doing is we're making a tyranny. We're making a tyranny called fascism. tyranny called Nazism, if you like. It's a tyranny all the same. Centralism, Marxism, Leninism, communism, socialism, whatever. And now we're seeing it in the form of, if you like, supercapitalism, where these central banks own the assets, or claiming that they own the assets of the entire world to do with as they see fit. And when we look at the environmental questions, sustainable development, the propaganda that goes with it, I'm not discounting environmental pollution. I believe it needs to be managed and we be stewards, and even rubbish in your own yard needs to be cleaned up. I agree with that. And so it should be with industry. I'm of the view that, say, industry, if it taps into water and uses it within the industry, it must be mandatory that the water, the effluent that they use, is put upstream of what they take, so that it is so clean that they're quite happy to reuse it again. That to me is responsible industry for the environment. But of course the license says go for it, just pollute, pollute, pollute. And we've got to come back, we've got to challenge that. I agree, there is truth in the environmental husbandry. There is truth in it. But sustainable development is the point where industry is just totally decimated and shut down, and we live a subsistence level. And that is all about power. It's not about anything else. It's just all about power. Your thoughts, please, Robert Klinck.
Yeah, well, I would agree with you, Arnie. I'm not saying that development should be so exaggerated that it isn't carried out responsibly. But the sustainable development is a policy that gives a small number of people in the community the right to define the economic activity that everyone else will be allowed to participate in. And that is dictatorship. Now, I think the fact that we've been deceived in our understanding that we're living in anything like democracy has been shattered for many people by this COVID crisis, in which governmental bodies, parliaments have all been emasculated, shut down often, and they seem to be totally ineffectual. And so the notion that they are representing the population in any way, I think has been shattered. That's a good thing. I mean, we haven't had democracy. We couldn't have democracy because we've had a system of finance that operates completely outside the control of the population, of the people. So money is the motor of policy. Without money in the economies that we have, the modern economies, nothing happens. So the people who are creating money, and it would be very good if people got their minds around the fact that the banks do create money out of nothing. Those people have a power over the entire society that makes a mockery of any notion of democracy. And this will continue until this concept of centralized control over finance is challenged and defeated. Now, it's a complicated thing. And one wonders, how in the world can you transfer control over finance to the population as a whole? But it ties back to that anomaly you mentioned, Arnie, that the production system doesn't distribute enough buying power to enable its products to be purchased by the people who are engaged in the productive activity. So it's obvious that if people are going to be enabled to buy what they're able to produce, they need a supplementary source of income. And this is where something that could be called economic democracy can be created, because this deficiency could be made up in the form of a dividend distributed to every citizen of the country. And every time you transfer the control over an element of finance to the population unconditionally, they just entitled to it on the basis of their being a member of the community and having the inheritance of the productive apparatus that exists in the community, then you can defeat this centralized control of policy. And the national dividend that is proposed by social credit is the way to do it. You've got the problem needs a solution, and the solution, if you think about it, is ready to hand and could easily be applied. Not only would it solve the problem of the deficiency of buying power, but it would also solve the problem to a great extent, of the lack of democracy, of democratic control over economic and governmental policy in our countries. We'll never have that democratic control as long as we have centralized finance. It's just an illusion, a delusion, and we've had it really forever. So people have been casting their votes, and they've been thinking that they were in some way the people authoring the policy of the country, but it's always been farcical. All you have to do is look at what happens in time of war, say, when finance is released and has total control over the policy of the country, developing unlimited amounts of armaments and conscripting everyone and sending them off to war so they can try to murder their neighbors. It's just a fantastic thing. People would not support that policy unless it was being imposed upon them. But it is the outcome of this centralized control of credit that has burdened and perverted our society for centuries now. And it has to be corrected. And as I said, there's an easy way to do it, and that is the proposal of Major C.H. Douglas for a regular national dividend distributed to the population unconditionally. This is not a universal basic income. This would be an amount of money that would be scientifically determined to enable the population to buy its own production. It would be an amount that would vary in accordance with the need to achieve that end. So it's a completely different concept from the UBI, which is also derived from taxation. And the dividend would be an addition to the money supply, not created in the form of debt.
Yeah. No, very well put. Very well put, Robert, that the universal basic income is a tax base. And of course, this is where, when industry is shut down, this sustainable development, you don't actually have wages going out into the community. Then, of course, the central banks will issue new credit that it creates out of thin air to governments, and governments will hand out this payment, this anomaly, because what they've done is for, if you like, hundreds, if not thousands of years, is they've denied that credit creation actually occurs. It occurs out of thin air. And when central banks do create this credit out of thin air and then issue it to regional banks, which then further issue it through loans, whether it's to government or private individuals, they create that out of nothing. It's just simply a bookwork exercise, if you like, electronic blips. That's all it exists in, that form. And very little actually is in the form of printed notes and coins. So very, very important to recognise that this ability, this power over government, it stops the whole thing. It bottlenecks it. It restricts the opportunity of every person in society of receiving their cultural inheritance. Now, part of our cultural inheritance is the vote. I mean, the women's suffrage is probably only 100 years old, a bit more maybe on some countries. Women's suffrage, it was an issue of a political vote. And that is the same, if you like, it's a correlation between the two of that issuing a certain amount of political right. That's what the vote is about. And so it is with economic democracy. It's issuing a certain amount of spending right of cultural inheritance that is yours and it belongs to you, not for the government to issue it, but something that is unique to you as part of your cultural inheritance of that particular community. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Klinck.
Yes, Arnie, I should mention that I have two, we're gone again.
No, you're not. Keep going.
Okay. I think I'm going to cut this screen. I've got two screens. All right, that's better, I think. I've cut the other screen out. There was a lot of echoing in the sound because I had two screens on. Now, yes, the whole idea of the cultural heritage, it's the incremental build-up, accumulation, or aggregation of developments in variety and efficiency of commodities that are useful to human beings and make life more pleasant, enjoyable, and more rich in experience. And Douglas said the prize is the unearned increment of association. Now, I was just talking about what we do refer to as the unearned increment of association. We have increments which occur, which are quite independent of labor. We have developed tools which contribute mightily to our total productivity. And labor is becoming increasingly displaced or replaced as an essential tool for production. So you see, if we had our inheritance, this would give us an enormous amount of economic independence, which would give us freedom. And the powers that be have done everything they can to make sure that the concept of the dividend has not come to the fore, or it can be seen, evaluated, and considered and opted for. Everything to this point seems to be a question of the state offering a privilege to the individual. But we don't get the unearned increment of association from the state. We get it from nature itself, from God, from nature, from reality, from things as they happen to exist. That's the source of our productivity. And we're engaging in a form of idolatry if we think that the state is the source of our creativity and our well-being and so on, and that the state alone can dish out or dispense these benefits. They come from nature itself. And we have to give a due recognition to their actual source. And that's why the dividend, Douglas said, everything is being done to discredit the idea of the dividend. Again, the dividend is regarded as profit. And profit, according to Marxists, is a form of exploitation of the worker by the employer. And so you see that it is to the benefit of the present financial system and the statist-oriented politicians and administrators to ensure that we do not realize that we have an inheritance that is our entitlement, quite apart and above politics. What we're getting from nature or from God is something that stands on a far higher level than anything that some human being or group of individuals or the state could possibly offer us, because they are exercising power over us. The things that we get in the way of a cultural heritage emancipate us, they free us so that we can choose what we wish to do and how we wish to do it and when we wish to do it, without having to take constant advice from something called the state or the government. So you see, it's a very different concept. Douglas said that economic or that political democracy without economic democracy is dynamite. It is, because it blinds people to the fact that there is another form of wealth, another form of inheritance, another form of democracy, a form of democracy where the individual, by his choices, is actually calling forth the forces which contribute to and make civilization. And that is a far higher concept than anything to do with temporal political democracy. And when you include economic democracy by constant reference to political democracy, you are depriving yourself of the essential element or element which is absolutely necessary if political democracy is to mean anything at all. You can vote for as much as you want. That does not mean you're getting what you want. And I don't think anyone can show any evidence that we are getting what we want and what we are entitled to have and what we should have and what we must demand.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Wally. That's very well put. What we must demand. I was I was visualising it even last night as to how would you actually get to a stage of ferment within the community where you're so frustrated that you had to ensure the government was actually going to do the very thing that it's meant to do. How would you get so frustrated? How can you actually exercise that power and challenge back? And I was thinking, okay, so you've got street marches, you've got perhaps violence and things like that, and I'm thinking that's such a poor option, because it actually all it does is increases the ferment without any clarity, And I think that to me the key to it is education for the individual and a completely different change of voting pattern. I think that is so important that we actually reconsider how we vote and what we vote. And of course, if the things that are going on in America are transposed to every other nation, then you've got very little confidence in the actual voting mechanism, as the voting mechanism appears to be so subverted in the United States. Your thoughts, please.
A nation without knowledge perishes. It's pretty well that simple.
Yeah, that's
in
right.
its essential meaning.
Yeah.
If you don't have knowledge, you can't do anything that knowledge would otherwise have enabled you to do.
Yeah.
Because it's essential to the achievement associated with it. So, and I think personally that a very concentrated effort has been made to sabotage the educational system to make darn good and sure that people do not have the knowledge that they require.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I see education at the moment. We've got a school I think it's in Victoria, and it's getting young boys to stand up and apologise to girls without having done anything wrong, but simply as a collective guilt exercise. And I note the increasing number of adverts, if you like, coming up through YouTube about domestic violence, about the attitude of males towards women, and this, of course, is going on, and this is going on at the same time as women's clothing becomes more and more provocative, or their behaviour becomes more and more whatever, and it doesn't work. It's inconsistent. That if the male is to respect, is going to learn to respect, or is going to respect the female, then they have to acknowledge the differences. And of course, that acknowledgement is actually being undone through our education system. Unisex toilets and things like that, it just becomes such a blur that how do you identify someone who may be female today was male yesterday and might be something different the day before? It's all over the place, and there is such
cultural poison and suicide.
Yeah,
and sabotage.
Yeah, sabotage of our culture. Robert Klinck, your thoughts, please.
Well, Wally quoted Douglas saying that political democracy without economic democracy is dynamite. And I think we can see that it's dynamite in the sense that it explodes society, because it sets up competing interests within society who try to acquire power through the electoral system. But this means that you have constant conflict within society, and you don't have any kind of general consensus developing. Yet, if you look at individuals, people who are not demented at least, they all basically want the same thing. They want security, and they want the means to enjoy the benefits of our economic productivity. So there is a commonality of interest there. But when people are fighting on the hustings about all sorts of irrelevant and artificial issues, you will never get them together. So that it's this party system that has been instilled, the idea that you have one group deciding everything and the other group attacking them for everything they decide. This is a formula for social disintegration, and yet it's been accepted for so long. You know, Wally talked about the importance of inheritance and the cultural heritage, but why has this not been recognized? And as he said, why has it not been taught in the school system? It's a fundamental truth that we have this fantastic productive heritage, the capital that comes down to us generation after generation. And we should be trying to define our rights in the fruits of that. But we aren't. Well, I can tell you why we aren't. It's because there is an inculcation of Marxist principles through the educational system. It gets worse and worse as you go higher and higher in it. You get to university and you'd be astounded by how many of the professors are actually trained Marxists. And I haven't been there for a long time. I was there in the 1960s. I could certainly see it then. And Marx said, as I think his third point of his 10 points of communism back in the Communist Manifesto that came out in 1848, that there would be no right of inheritance. There has been an active attack on the very principle of inheritance by these people who want to deny the right of the individual to run his own affairs, to choose his own priorities in life, and to enjoy the benefits of the inventiveness and creativity of previous generations. That's our inheritance. We should be able to activate it, to realize it, but we aren't, because that principle is not recognized anywhere. It's not recognized in economic theory that is taught in universities. It's not recognized by any politician. They won't go there because it is such a dramatic challenge to everything we see going on in our society. We have this enormous acquisition of debt that has come about supposedly to deal with the COVID crisis. Well, this is going to be used against the population, and it's going to be used to destroy even more any access we have to our cultural heritage. We're going to have to pay for this at some point. And I wonder who in the world gave these governments the authority to contract hundreds of billions of dollars of debts, or trillions, as Arnie said, in the case of the United States, that the population is responsible for repaying, but they had not a word to say in the decision to undertake those borrowings. It's astonishing. What individual would allow his neighbor to go out and borrow tens of thousands of dollars and attribute the responsibility for repaying them to him. It doesn't make any sense. But because our governments are actually dictatorships under the direction of the financial powers, they've been able to do this. And the total lack of democratic control over the process has been illustrated by the fact that we just have allowed them to go ahead, and we're swallowing whatever the consequences will be. The consequences are not going to be funny. And another point I would make is that in response to the COVID crisis and the drastic attack on our freedoms and rights that have accompanied the response to it, you see people starting new powers and new parties rather, and the parties are purporting to be able to restore the rights we've been deprived of, that we've lost. But this is an astonishing thing. Does this mean that our rights are dependent upon our electing a party every time there's a federal election that will respect them? Surely our rights have a more solid foundation than that. But we're seeing that they really don't. And all these parties that are being organized in order to bring back the old normal and preserve us from the new normal are going to go nowhere, and they're just a distraction from the fact that we have rights that come not from politics, not from any politician, not from any other man. They come from God. And we don't have to start a new political party in order to regain them, because they are in fact largely enshrined in constitutions, but the dictatorship governments that have emerged during this COVID crisis have undermined all constitutions. And we see that, as George Bush Jr. allegedly said, they're just goddamn pieces of paper. They don't seem to mean very much. Well, that cannot be allowed to continue. We have to reassert our rights and not say that the only way to do that is to create a new political party and wait for 1, 2, 3, 4 elections in order to get our rights back. This is insanity. We have to say that we have these rights as enshrined in constitutions, and we want them preserved against the encroachments of ambitious politicians.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Robert Klinck. That as the barons at Runnymede had to face the challenge, and I know that in one of the booklets that I read about it, they actually placed their armor before the altar and spent the evening in prayer before they took the oath before Stephen Langton, Archbishop Stephen Langton, that even if their lives were lost, they would still pursue these ancient rights, these ancient freedoms. That's the real story of Magna Carta. And of course the barons were a reflection of the people. They were a reflection of the people at the time, and this is part of our culture, this is part of our history, of the tyrant being subdued, not destroyed, but subdued. And in this case it was in the form of King John. And the tyrant, of course, arose again in the form of Henry VIII when he insisted that the crown of church and state would be on his head, both church and state. And of course since then the state church has been emasculated, and we see no different in Australia. The charitable status of our churches is always the blackmail. I note that one particular denomination has had their charitable status challenged, and I'm sure that's a warning to all of the churches to keep your mouth shut, or you'll lose this lucrative benefit. So it's a form of blackmail. Your thoughts, please, Wallace Klinck.
Well, Arnie, in Canada, you probably well know, we have now a situation here, even in Alberta, where the state police, government police, are moving in directly to congregations and arresting pastors. Now, I'm not taking up any particular pastor's cause, but anyone in general should be able to conduct religious or philosophical or ideological or whatever activities which are related to the educational and spiritual knowledge and well-being of the people. This is frankly, it's unheard of. It's these people are doing things which King John would have lost his head for sure if he had not bowed to the barons when they said, "Look, we have rights and we demand them, and we're going to have them brought into being. They're going to made of effect." And he saved his head by becoming a little bit more cooperative. And it was slightly modified 2 or 3 years later, I believe, and added to, augmented. But in any case, no, these people are doing things now. They would have lost their heads in those days. People seem to have, maybe it was a simpler form of life. Maybe they weren't confused about every form of sophistry and complexity that we're beset with today. Maybe they had a little bit more of a clear idea of what they were, who they were, and why they were, and what their rights were in terms of what they realized that they actually were as human beings. Now, the politicians today are just playing us for fools. They're and the people behind them who are controlling them are no doubt quite amused at the degree to which, the ease with which people can be manipulated. It's unbelievable. And but people are afraid. They're afraid of losing any little aspect of what they see as their security, which is actually their enslavement. And so they're reluctant to become too aggressive, and they have been handing out fines which are absolutely enormous, phenomenal, oppressive, outrageous. Fines running up, I think, in the most extreme cases to possibly $100,000. But anyway, lots of fines in the $10,000 category. And, that's ruinous. That's terrifying for people, ordinary people. They can't afford that sort of thing. They are literally imposing policies by totalitarian means, and they can't deny it. They can't hide it. And people should simply say that is enough.
Yeah, thank you, Wally. That's right. That is enough. Where is the boundary? Where is the boundary of government? Jesus was tested with that coin. Whose face was on the coin? Caesar's. Then render the things that belong to Caesar unto Caesar, but the things that belong to God unto God. And this is the disparity when Henry VIII, of course, wanted both crowns on his head. He insisted that he had authority even over the things of God, and he could come up with his own form of theology, and then that form of theology be imposed on the populace. And of course, this is bunkum. This is madness. Does government operate under its own authority? Is it supreme? Is the Parliament supreme? Or are there rights? Are there laws? Are there principles? Is there something over and above the whole world that holds it together? I'm of the view that there is. We call that the canon. We call it, if you like, the Christian doctrine of principles, the absolute law, the natural law, the way things actually work. These are the things that we need to consider in this pursuit of our ancient freedoms, the restoration of our ancient freedoms, but also in an industrial time of plenty, a time of abundance, a time of if you like, material security, which we are being deprived of. We are being, it's being stopped up, it's being withheld deliberately. Because if it was there, if it was obvious to people, then of course they would never, ever relinquish this to government. But government is insisting that it is their prerogative, and of course government is controlled by central banks. This is where policy originates from. International central banks that have no appreciation of, if you like, nation states, and certainly not of the individual. It is a collective perspective, and whether it's in the form of supercapitalism or it's in the form of communism, it's still the same. It's a collective perspective. You're just cogs in the wheel, and you're just a political unit that we can exploit to whatever benefit we determine. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Robert Klinck.
Well, that's very true, Arnie. And one of the deceptions that has been imposed upon the thinking of the population is that there is some kind of antagonism between finance, capitalism, and socialism or communism. They aren't. They have always worked in a cooperative way. And in fact, if you look at every revolution in history, it has been financed by big bankers. I mean, this is just a fact of history. So we've got to get over this idea that the conflict exists between the financial power and the revolutionary power in society. It's just not true. They facilitate each other. I think this has been demonstrated beyond all question by the advocacy by hundreds upon hundreds of the biggest corporations in the world of all these politically correct principles. They're all favoring what is called political correctness. And people don't realize that political correctness is a term that was evolved in the Marxist discussions in the early 20th century. Political correctness is a Marxist concept, and yet it is accepted, and knees are taken to it by politicians everywhere in our societies, as though this was a perfectly natural thing. It isn't. It's a revolutionary policy, and it's designed to create conflict in society, which will generate dialectical situations that can be used to concentrate power. So this is the situation we're in today, and it is a departure from the concept that people had, generally speaking, back in the time of the Magna Carta. In the time of the Magna Carta, a man was regarded as a part of this canon, the universe created by God, and he was regarded as having a responsibility to the Creator. He didn't have that kind of responsibility to any other man. The accountability to God superseded everything else. And very few people are thinking clearly about that today. It's a tragic situation. If they could clarify that in their minds, and I think it is coming into the consciousness of a lot of people, because they're finding that what we're developing into right now is unthinkable. It's such a dark future that is looming ahead, that they're questioning their fundamental attitudes toward things. So it's a time of ferment, and it's a time when issues are being clarified, and hopefully the resolution of the fermentation will be in favor of the older concept, where the individual was a free agent. He had free will, but he was responsible not to indulge it wildly without consideration, but to use it responsibly in accordance with the intentions of his Creator.
Yeah, beautifully put. Thank you so much for that, Robert. Before I give you the floor, Wally, I just want to cut across to one of our website libraries, and that is this is the normal PDF library. You'll find it here on the right in the navigation bar. Down the bottom right-hand side, you've got Marx and Satan by Richard Wurmbrand. It's very important to recognise that the roots of Marxism, Marxist-Leninism, if you like, are within Satanism, and Marx was not only an advocate but a practicer of it. It was part of his philosophy, of where he actually found, if you like, the seeds of this outworking, which we call cultural Marxism, or if you like, Sovietization, if you like another word. Now, in our On Target, our homepage, you will have at the bottom below the On Target, you will have the social dynamics videos. It really is fundamental that you go through those videos and podcasts. You go through them to help you understand why is philosophy so important. And on the basis of philosophy, Lecture 2 is about the real credit, not just financial credit, but the real credit of the community. This is what we've been talking about today, industrialism and technology. And of course, ultimately, the money cult. Why is it a cult? It's a cult because people are confused about it's essentially a religious perspective on what makes up money. Money is actually just a book recording. Your accountant could do it, in a sense, as long as it is faithfully recorded, similar to weights and measures. And we're not seeing that today. We're seeing a completely skewed and demented perspective of the cultural inheritance that we have. Your thoughts and closing comments, please, Wallace Klinck.
Well, yes, Arnie, money is simply an agreement. And it's based on your credit, your actual ability, and true intent of carrying out an agreement. And today we do that in the form of mathematical figures. We have to have some kind of a rational and organized approach to the complexities of carrying on modern existence, and we can't just be completely casual about it. We have to be organized. We have to have records. And so that money is simply, as you say, accountancy, and that's all it is. And people who try to make more of it are obfuscating the situation and causing all sorts of unnecessary confusion, and which leads to nowhere. It's not productive or creative. It's destructive. And I think that if you look at the state of modern economics, my goodness, they have more terms that they use to try and explain certain phenomena within the economic sphere. Terms which are so high-flown, so into the stratosphere, absolutely abstract, things which really are of no significant importance at all. What is important that people are honest, that they make agreements with each other to produce and to produce results, and that they have the intent and the ability to actually do those things. So, and it's in consumption, the crown of economics, real economics, that we find the end, nature, and purpose of economics. Economics is something we do with a purpose, and that purpose is human satisfaction, utility, meaning, usefulness. And money has become so abstract that it is absolutely incredible to listen to these people with the terms that they bring up. And it's done, I'm quite sure, just to make absolutely certain that no clarity shall ever emerge about the institution of money, which is the most marvelous invention. But it's an invention that has been perverted and turned on its head in the interest of those who would seek power over their fellow man. It should merely be a stimulus to production and distribution and consumption.
Yeah, thank you for that, Wally. I want to actually, I've brought up something here, and I just find it interesting. An economist was talking about the budget, and he used the words requiem, a requiem mass, a requiem. This is the word that he is using in this particular article about economic responsibility. A requiem. What sort of, what sort of abstraction is that word? What does it denote in your mind? What does it actually cause you to think of? A mass, something presiding over a holy situation. They are the words that economists use to, if you like, cause such confusion in our mind, such confusion. No wonder we can't understand what they're talking about, because it's a form of witchcraft. That's what it is. It's deliberately, purposely a form of witchcraft. That's what economics is about. Whereas, and this is why Douglas social credit is such the threat to communism, world communism. They even saw it as a threat so much that they actually seized the name social credit to denote their police surveillance state. They want people to be confused about the word social credit, and in particular Douglas social credit, because the words social credit, society's credit, the credo, how much do they believe and trust each other? That is the cultural inheritance that's been built up over eons and is being torn apart in front of us. So important for us to recognise, and that's why I keep reinforcing education is so important. I spend all of my available time on educating, on reading, on studying, on considering, contemplating. And my mind is not massive. Mine is just a simple man, practical background, practical upbringing. My hands are involved in the soil, in mechanics, in carpentry, in refining, all the sorts of things that you have to deal with the real world. And when I see a word like requiem to do with numbers, then of course they're attempting to what? Spiritualize the concept of the budget, attempting to spiritualize it, want some sort of abstraction, whereas what it is just simply numbers, and the numbers don't add up. The numbers are in the situation where the issue of new credits coming from central banks is such that the whole world is bankrupt. And these people who issue these numbers, and that's all they issue is numbers, these people who issue these numbers are claiming that the real assets of the entire world belong to them, because they issue numbers. That's all they're doing. That's what all these central banks are doing. Now, Australia has a history of the Commonwealth Bank, 1911. It opened its doors 1912 to 1924 until it was emasculated by, in my view, criminal politicians. Criminal politicians, and that's been repeated again and again and again. Finally, the Commonwealth Bank was sold under criminal politicians who would enslave the whole nation. That's what's going on. Wake up, Australia. Wake up, Canada. Wake up, the world. Because the people who issue these numbers, Marx and Satan, have a look at it. Read what Wurmbrand wrote. This is what's going on. They're using this particular dialectics, the argument of opposites, in order to confuse us, to confound our thinking. And in the very words of, what is it, the third verse of God Save the Queen? Confound their knavish tricks. Unto thee their hopes we fix. God Save the Queen. These words were written with that hymn, that holy hymn of the national, we call it our national anthem, that holy hymn. These words are written, these knavish tricks are laid out in front of us, and we have to clarify our thinking. And that can only happen with an effort, with discipline, with research, with reading, with studying. And we've provided you with the tools, but you have to choose your personal responsibility. And in that, bring about a better world where the economic democracy is realised, where you are free to choose or refuse one thing at a time, and there is a sufficiency in that choice, not issued from government, but ultimately issued from God. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for today's forum. It's always interesting, it's tough, it's budget time, requiem, A requiem budget, baloney. It's fiddling with the numbers. It's imposing debt on us till it's going out of style with the intention, the purpose, the intent to foreclose on the entire nation. That's what our governments are doing. That's what they're doing. They're sending us into slavery, financial slavery that we possibly won't get out of for 1,000 years. Consider what's going on very, very carefully. Thank you so much, Robert and Wallace Klinck.
Thank you, Arnie.